Astrological. It's nice to see so many happy faces around. So let's start the session, and our first guest speaker for today is Mr. Robert Currey of UK, and he is going to speak on the subject Astro Carto Graphy. So sir, I request you please join me on the dais.
যাচ্ছে কোথায়?
Namaste.
Swagatam.
Mere. Astro Carto Graphy. K. Vyakya. May. May Kolkata. May Aka. Hot. Push. Pua. Are you able to get to the stomach? Okay. Now, what is astrocartography? And there are many descriptions of what it is. Gopal is talking about Western and Eastern astrology as being two sides of the same coin, and astrocartography is the coin, in the sense that it can work by both Vedic astrology and Western astrology. Okay.
ধরবো হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ কে ডাকছিল সন্দীপ বলে কে সন্দীপ আছে এবার নাম চেঞ্জ
Can you hear me at the back? Okay. Wait a second. Okay. So anyway, what's astrocartography? That's the question. Next slide, please. And it is two sides. Astrology, East and West, two sides of the same coin. And astrocartography works under both systems. That's important. But to astrologers, we see astrocartography as where planets are angular on the angles throughout the Earth at a specific moment in time. But for most people, astrocartography is how can I find a place for love, happiness, money, and that's the popular view of what it is. But as I see it, time and space are, as Einstein discovered, a continuum. And when we do astrology, we're looking at the quality of time. And that's when we work out transits, progressions, other techniques of forecasting. But also we need to look at the quality of space as well, and that's where astrocartography comes in. So I see it as important as forecasting methods. Now, story starts with Jim Lewis. He was a bright young astrologer in the 60s in San Francisco at the time when San Francisco was a big hippie center. And he found that when he drove, next slide please, when he drove inland to Salt Lake City, his car tended to break down, tended to overheat every time he got there. And he wondered what was happening. So what he did was he created a relocated horoscope for Salt Lake City, as if he was born there. And he noticed that two planets, could you go back a slide please? Two planets where Mars was directly above and Mercury was rising at that point. And he realized that Mercury, symbolic of a vehicle, a car, Mars overheating, it seemed quite powerful. And they formed what's known as Paran, or a Paran Atelemata. I won't be using that word very often, but we call it a Paran, with two planets on the angle. And he felt this was significant. So he then worked out that from this, he could draw a map showing where the planets were angular throughout the world. And he started out by hand-drawing maps. And gradually, he got software to do it. But the tragedy is that Jim was very successful in promoting astrophotography, but he died age 53 in 1995. But anyway, he didn't invent astrophotography as a concept, but he did trademark the name. Next slide, please. And these are the different ways we do astrophotography. There are maps, you can have analyses. Next slide, please. Or there's software, and you can get maps online. We happen to be, I studied under Jim, and I also developed a new version of his software to include Rahu and Ketu, and to include the Chiron, and we improved it a bit, and we have the license to sell the official maps, but people can buy unofficial maps, or they can go to consultants who can pick cases. There's also about maybe 20 books or so on astrophotography, and which are a great source. So he's left quite a legacy, but he never was able to fulfill all that he wanted to do. Next slide, please. Now, this is a typical map. Okay, you've got 49 lines. Each planet, what we call it, sun and moon planets, and we call Chiron planets, and Rahu and Ketu is referring as a planet. But there are 4 lines, and here they go. So next slide, please. We'll just show the different planetary lines. Now, I know there was some talk about people not using symbols, or so I thought I'd just go through very quickly. I'm going to give a very short resume of what each line is going to be. But if you've got this book, on page 108, you can go through a description of what each line might mean. Okay? So a sun line, for example, this is, for most astrologers, this would be very basic stuff, but if you're learning astrophotography for the first time, it helps just to get this idea. So the sun line is about where you are more creative, more confident, but you can also be more arrogant on a sun line, more overconfident. But often you can have a feeling that you're like a star. And like a moon line is where you are more sensitive, where you feel at home, where you feel comfortable. But again, in the moon line, you could be oversensitive. So it works both ways in all these lines. Mercury line is where it's very good for writers, communicators, teachers, or for studying students. But again, people can get very nervous on the Mercury line, so again, that works both ways. And the Venus line, a lot of people say, well, this is a wonderful line because you're going to fall in love. But as you will see, it doesn't always work that way. But the Venus line can be both where you might be more attractive, where you might be more romantic. It's very good for art. Doesn't matter. Almost in all cases, if you've got any artistic talent, almost any Venus line will work very, very well. But also, people can be superficial, people can be false, and nobody actually tells you what's going on. So there's there's 2 sides on that. Again, you look at the Mars line, and the Mars line is where you have a lot of energy. You know what you're doing, you're able to make decisions, but you also find there can be hostility, as we will see as it goes on. The Jupiter line is, one thinks, a lot of astrologers have said in the past that these are going to be very successful places, but they're not always like that for people. But on the Jupiter line, people, they can be successful, they tend to be much more optimistic. But I give you an example. If the Jupiter was on your IC, Okay, which is through the home and the family. You might find that you get a large home, a comfortable home, a spacious home, but you also go over your budget and you can't afford it. So this is not necessarily how it's going to be every time, but that's generally how it is. Anyway, and then the South Line, and they get a pretty bad press, but it can be a place of a lot of accomplishment, where people get their life together, but also it can be a place where you can feel lonely and isolated from people. And Uranus line is where you tend to be you feel very liberated, very original, and it can be very exciting, but also it can be a place where there's a lot of sudden shocks and surprises. Now, the interesting thing about a Uranus line and a Neptune line is the Uranus line is where you enjoy being different, when you don't fit in. The Neptune line is where you do fit in. You are quite seamless, and you move around as if you've always been in that community, wherever it might be. With the Neptune line, you're more compassionate, but there can be delusion, illusion, there can be scandal on those lines, but it's also very spiritual. And the Pluto line, what I find with clients is that very often there's a crisis when they first arrive there, and the crisis often leads to a fundamental change. And that's but it's not always disastrous. Quite often the crisis is where you let go of baggage that you've been carrying, and it's a really big plus. But sometimes it can really be a feeling of loss on a Pluto line. But often people discover their power on a Pluto line. So that's another line. And then we've also got Chiron lines, which are very interesting to me because Jim Lewis didn't really know very much about Chiron. He thought it was a good idea to put on a map, but people didn't know very much about it. But it seems to be, if it can, on the negative side, it can be, people can suffer from health, from poor health on the Chiron line. But what tends to happen is that you can feel fragmented or aware of how you might be fragmented. And the idea is that you are, circumstances encourage you to become whole, to get all the different parts of you together into a single unit, to synthesize your life. Quite often people find it difficult maybe to combine home and work. On a Chiron line, you're forced to work on that. And if you don't work on it, it causes a lot of stress, and the stress can lead to illness. But it can also lead to discovery of healing powers. On the node line, now really, I'll be honest, I'm here to find out more about the node rather than Ketu, because I'm not an expert. What I do find is there's often a feeling, say you have the north node down on the IC, to do with the home, it's like you feel like you've been there before, and then the south node down below, the north node is where you are learning in your career, you're discovering, and you might be quite obsessive in that area. In my own experience on the node line, quite often people have to, I'm going to describe it differently, like they have to slay a dragon. There's sometimes a family issue they have to address. Anyway, these are just some thoughts. Very quickly, the planets on the ascendant are to do with your personality. Planets on the IC, home and family issues will come up. Planets on the descendant to do with relationships, and planets at the midheaven to do with your public life and your career. Okay, next slide, please. So imagine you're on the moon, and you look to the Earth, and you can actually see a dark, where the dark and the light borders, and that's sunset coming up. So next slide, please. And if you drew a line along that sunset point, it would look like this in the globe. And you can also put the point where the sun was directly above, which is the sun midheaven line. Next slide, please. Now, you can then project that onto a map of the world, and you end up with 4 lines: sunset, midday, sunrise, midnight. And that's how it works to get the sun lines. Now, imagine you do that with all the planets, and that's how the map is created. The sloping lines are the sunrise and sunset, and the reason they're sloping is because the map you see is a flat projection of a circular surface. Okay, next slide, please. Now, this is Jim, And he did a study of American presidents. This is a really good topic to study because, firstly, everybody knows who they are. Secondly, they travel a lot, or they affect a lot of different parts of the world. And thirdly, a lot of energy goes into finding out their time of birth. Often this can be questionable, the time of birth, but the research that goes into it means that you've got really good database. And the other thing about it is when you pick ACG lines, or you pick samples, people can think you're cherry picking. You say you pick some great star that happens to, it works for your theory, but if you say, I'm going to do American presidents come what may, then you can't be accused of cherry picking. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now, one of the most famous things that Jim forecast was that Nixon was going to have problems in Washington. Now, several things that Jim found. One was where the Mars lines fell in American presidents' charts were very often where they went to war, where there was hostility, they met hostility. We look at that. And the other thing he found is when they go to Washington, or their lines over the city of Washington, DC, were coloured their experience of their presidency. So in Nixon's case, we have Neptune here. And as I say, Neptune can be to do with illusion and scandal, as everybody knows. But Nixon had to resign as president as a result of his of Watergate. Anyway, next slide, please. And that was credit to Jim that he came up with that. Now, but Nixon's Neptune line also went through Thailand, Cambodia, or right through Cambodia over there. And, well, you can see the red dot. But now, what we later discovered, more recently through the Pentagon Papers, was that the bombing in Vietnam actually extended into Cambodia during Nixon's time. So he was, and nobody knew, so the whole idea of Neptune being that subterfuge or scandal or confusion, these qualities were brought in, not just in Washington, but also in Vietnam. He also had, there was a massacre of My Lai massacre happened under Nixon's presidency. And that was a very scandalous, they had to review the behavior of the soldiers out there. Anyway, next slide. Now, what interested me was, because I was coming here, I thought, I'd just see if any American president had any big link with India, in the last 12 presidents. And Nixon did, and he had not a good relationship with Indira Gandhi, and there's lots of stories that Nixon kept her waiting for a meeting, and she asked in Hindi in an interview, it's like, they were having a discussion, she said, is this going to go on for very long? But they both got on with other people, but they had a difficult relationship. Now, Nixon's Mars line is a very difficult Mars line. It's Mars and Mercury and Jupiter together, opposite Pluto. Now, this is someone who has very strong opinions and can be very outspoken. Now, that was, it's just above Moscow, and he had a big confrontation with Khrushchev and nearly went to nuclear war, but didn't. But he also had this difficult relationship, and it went right through India with Indira Gandhi, and right through India. So that's sort of how it worked. He didn't go to war, but there was a very hostile kind of relationship. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things about astrocartography is you don't actually have to go to a place. You might have feelings about, you might like films from a certain country, that type of thing. But with American presidents or leaders, world leaders, they would often find that in countries they didn't even visit, their astrocartography got activated. In this case, next slide, Margaret Thatcher and her Mars line, who was the UK Prime Minister, her Mars line up through the Falkland Islands, where she went to war. So it wasn't just American presidents, but it's another example. Next slide, please. Okay, And here we have another example of remote activation of astrocartography. George Bush, and his Mars line goes right through Afghanistan, which is the first war that he went to. And this was long after Jim had said his theory. He died many years before this, but it seems to be the presidents have carried on for performing just as he described. Next slide, please. Okay, this is Obama, and I didn't, when I first saw it, I didn't imagine that he would be going to war in the Middle East, having inherited a bad situation he was hoping to change. But it does turn out that the Mars line goes right close to Raqqa, which is the center of ISIS, or ISIL, which is where he's had a bombing campaign, which is where he's had a lot of hostility. Next slide, please. Jimmy Carter was a classic. This was one that Jim Lewis felt was, just epitomized how astrocartography could work. Because he never went to Tehran, but he had Mars and Jupiter crossing just off Tehran. And if you think of Jupiter as being religion and Mars as being war, you have a combination. So there's a kind of jihad situation that he had with the Iran hostages. But the interesting thing is, after Jim died, he had a Venus line going through North Africa, Northeast Africa. It went quite near Israel, and he did broker peace talks in Israel, but Carter also, after his presidency, had many peace missions to the areas around Darfur and other parts of North Africa. So that the Venus line worked very well for him, but the Mars line was extremely difficult. Next slide. And here's Bill Clinton. Now, this is an interesting one, because Bill Clinton didn't really go to war. And if you look, his Mars lines don't really cross many controversial areas apart from the United Kingdom. And next slide, we'll get a close-up of that. You see, what he has is Bill Clinton had Mars and Neptune and Venus all conjunct on his rising sign. And he was known as a womanizer, a philanderer, but also when he went those three planets combined over the UK. And he went to Oxford. He took an interest in rugby, which is a sport, which is a Mars activity. He also protested against the Vietnam War. And though he was American, he protested against it. And so he was militant in trying to get peace. When he was president, he also brokered a peace deal in Northern Ireland Peace Agreement. And again, that was obviously close to his Mars line. So what we're seeing is Mars does not necessarily mean war, but it means you could be quite militant about it, or militant about peace, because Mars and Venus would be Mars would be the hawk and Venus would be the dove, and he had the mix of the two together, so that's how his Mars worked. It was different. The other thing about it is that it was alleged he smoked cannabis at Oxford, and that was going to perhaps disqualify him for being president. I don't know. But he said he never actually inhaled, but I had a friend of mine who was in this college, his university college, who confirmed he definitely did, just in case anyone had any doubt about that. Next slide, please. Now, this is just a summary of all the last 12 presidents, a lot of information. And by the way, in 30 minutes, it's going to be very difficult to get the whole of astrocartography, because it normally takes a good weekend to do. But hopefully we can get a lot of ground. This information, I think it's published in the booklet. I think the table is. But it just shows every single president on their Mars line had an issue of hostility or war, or they were very militant about the issues of war. But two of them, what's interesting, the last five were, though Jim Lewis was alive for the last two, neither of which we knew the times. Strange enough, though Reagan employed an astrologer, we still don't know for certain his time, and I've actually rectified this chart here. And that works out that he had, there's quite, I won't go into exactly all the things, but the rectification worked out that we had, I think it was Pluto in Washington, which is where the assassination attempt. Mars happened to go on Tripoli, where he was bombing, and I think Pluto went to Nicaragua. There were a number of other things that confirmed. So this might be a way of using astrocartography to rectify someone's chart where you're not certain about the time. I found it quite useful anyway. So that's a bit dubious, you can't be certain. And then George H. Bush, his time of birth wasn't known. Or Jim Lewis, they gave out an incorrect one during Jim's life, and he actually wrote in his book, and really, I can't understand why George H. Bush does not have Mars going through the sands of Iraq, or Kuwait, for example. But when you look at his, when they released the time, it actually is quite likely that he did have Mars going through that area. Anyway, let's see the next slide. Okay, now, this is a question I often get asked is, could you go back? Oh yeah, great, that's it, that's good. What people say, if I go to my Venus sign, will I find love? Now, it does sometimes work. And in this instance, John Lennon's Venus line goes just off Tokyo, the birthplace of Yoko Ono. Yoko Ono's Venus line goes through Liverpool, the birthplace of John Lennon. So it's a wonderful kind of example of how it can work. But it didn't always work that way. And this was a problem for Jim. Next slide, please. A lot of books came out, a lot of cookbooks, and they tended to give very standard interpretation of the planets. I mean, it was a good way of getting into astrocartography, but it meant that a lot of people got slightly the wrong impression about how the lines could work. And Jim himself was quite guilty of saying some very negative things about Saturn lines and Pluto lines, and people used to be quite concerned because they might live on a Pluto line and they didn't have that experience. So the limitations of these of the cookbooks, but they had a role. Next slide, please. Now, what tended to happen in these books is authors tended to categorize the planets as good planets and bad planets, and and this didn't turn out. It worked out that this wasn't the situation with planets. And there was a kind of hierarchy of planets, the Sun, Venus, Jupiter, Mercury, and the Moon all getting very good analyses, and those lines were considered really, really great lines. And then the Jupiter, the Saturn, Pluto, Mars, Neptune, and Uranus were always lines to avoid. And it was next slide, please. It was like the dark versus the light. It was like you were fighting this internal war, and the astrocartography lines could sort it out for you. You just go to the nice places. Next slide, please. So, this is Jim, and he said, what can I do? How, this is not working well enough. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. Sure, people feel the effects of Venus, but they aren't always happy. I mean, I had an astrologer. She said, I don't believe in astrocartography. I said, why is that? She said, my Jupiter line goes through Houston, and I hate Houston. I said, well, tell me about your Jupiter. And her Jupiter was square Pluto. And I said, well, maybe there's a reason for that, because you're activating the Jupiter square Pluto, even though you've got Jupiter. Anyway, so next slide. So Jim's revelation was, if you get the astrocartography map and you align it with the natal chart, you then can understand how the planets work. Next slide. And Jim found that the main thing he developed was the Jungian idea of the shadow, so that his idea that some planets really don't fit into your chart because of the nature of how it is. And, say for instance, you have one planet in water and you have a lot of fire, you might find that planet in water, or maybe a lot of oppositions or something, they get projected outside, so you meet people on the outside world who can make you very angry, or you have situations that get you very upset due to this planet which seems like it's outside of you, it's not part of you. Now naturally, you go to that planet line. Jim's point was this was why people have disasters on those particular lines. And he did find this works, and as we see, it worked with the presidents as well as other people. But anyway, we've gone ahead. That's okay. The thing about the lines is that the idea that I've worked on more is you need to play to your strengths. You need to work out, for you or for your client, what is the best planet or planets for you personally. And they're not all the same. And the example I'm giving is if say you were a left-footed footballer, you need to be on the left side of the pitch so you can kick the ball this way. But for a right-sided footballer, it wouldn't work. So, and it's the same with cricket. We've got Zahir Khan, and he's bowling over the wicket as opposed to around the wicket. And a lot of bowlers feel that's an advantage to be bowling in that way. So it's the same with us. If we are on the right, we can handle difficult planets, but if we've got a choice, let's go to planets where we really shine and we use our talents. Next slide, please. Okay, now one of the things when picking lines, I have found, first off, very young children, I tend not to pick lines very much for them unless there's a very particular reason. And I rather like the idea that children just experience life, and it's the parents who need the good lines to be good parents. Anyway, but when you get someone a bit older, say for instance they're into sport or they're ambitious, they want then a few squares to the chart, like a planet's a little bit stressful, is actually quite a good thing. And then as people get older, you tend to make it easier and easier. And retired people, I will always look for very easy, non-stress planets for them. Next slide. Now, one of the questions people ask is, is there a difference between the east and the west of the line? And there is. Most times it is better to be west of an ACG line. And the best example, and the one that's most clear, is the sun line. And if you are to the sun rising line, if you are to the east of the sun rising line, your sun is in the 12th house. If you're to the west of the sun rising line, your sun is in the first house. Now, most people, and it really depends on the kind of person you are and the job you're doing, but most people prefer to have a first house sun than a 12th house sun. And I have actually, in many cases with clients, suggested they move from the 12th to the 1st, and it has changed their lives very dramatically. And it just suddenly reminds me of someone, just came into my head, a lady, a client of mine in Australia, and she has crossed over, went further north to get to her crossover group. So her son's in the first house, and it was she went out to this yacht club, and they all said to her, "Listen, why don't you come and live here? Why don't you come and join our club?" And she said, she's in her 60s. She said, "No one has ever invited me to anything before, and suddenly I'm being welcomed." It was just an interesting thing, whereas she's had terrible problems. Anyway, so, and the same applies. It's not so clear about the other houses, but it is particularly, it's moving really to the angular houses and the cable houses. But this is subject to everybody's opinion. You may find a planet will work better in some way, but generally, if in doubt, west is slightly better. Next slide, please. The distance on the lines, this is a funny thing. The lines are moving very fast. They're moving, we'll reach that 1,000 miles an hour, 1,600 kilometers per hour. And that is, means that the time of birth has got to be within half an hour. And that is about 7 degrees difference on the angles, which I think is acceptable. But more than that, there's no point even doing an astrography map, because you're going to give completely the wrong impression. And yeah, next slide, please. This is an example. This is George Bush's Mars, which goes through Afghanistan, and you see, this isn't precise, this is just like a schematic drawing, but how I feel is it's like a curved line. When you get closer to the line, the impact is stronger. As you move away, it eases off. So when you say, 500 kilometers, it's still active, but sometimes I say that it's about 50% active. And that helps them sort of understand how it might work. Next slide, please. Is there another slide? Go for it. Now this is something people say, never do your own chart or anything like that, but I just thought I'd put my own photography mark on. And the reason is that, well, first off, I was interested in what my lines are here, and I have the sun setting. I actually have Venus and Moon in heaven, but I have the sun setting. For astrologers, why is the setting round so straight? It's a bit weird because I'm very close to the equinox, and I call my company equinox, and that's, if the sun is close to the equinox, then, or any planet, it will tend to be quite straight on an astrocartography line. Anyway, what interested me is what I'm sort of doing is promoting the work of somebody else, which is quite a seventh house activity. I didn't plan it that way, but it just happened. And then I saw the sun descending, so that's quite appropriate. But the other thing is, I was going to say, astrocartography also can tell you your self-worth, because I, one time, let's just try this clip out. Let's see whether, no, can't get it to work. No, I don't want to blind people, but anyway, I was flying with my wife from San Francisco across to Hawaii, and I've been doing astrocartography a long time. I always look at the lines and things like that, but even if you do astrocartography, you can really be a kind of victim of it. And halfway along, I was drinking some water, and I drank it like this, and the ice, I never had this happen to me before. Well, I've choked before, but the ice got caught, I couldn't breathe. So I got up into the aisle, started walking up and down, and the air hostess trying to give me water, which wasn't any good. And it was getting worse and worse. Then my wife got up, and she did the Heimlich move, and I was okay. And it felt like a near-death experience, but being on my Pluto line, and I have South and Square Pluto. But in the end, United Airlines gave her 10,000 miles for saving my life. And so, in that sense, astrocartography did tell me what I was worth, which was 10,000 air miles. Anyway, he's saying 12, so that's good. Anyway, so now how are we doing for time? How's our time? You're okay? I can go on? Right? 5 minutes, okay. Let's do the next one. Now, this is a classic map, ACG map of John Kennedy. And he has, there's a lot of things, one can go into lots of things. Let's just see what next slide, because we do a close-up of part of it. This was Moscow. He, as I'm sure you know, it was the height of the Cold War. He had a huge confrontation with Russia. And his Mars IC line went right through there. Next slide. Could I have the next? Yeah. Now, what interested Jim, and he was doing astrocartography at the time, and it was that the Pluto line goes just off Dallas where he was assassinated. I also noticed subsequently that Chiron was very close to Dallas as well. It was exactly in Dallas, and Chiron could also be to do with reading in that sense. Now, if you go on to the next slide, what we see is that there's a high incidence of an attempt on the life of a president or assassination when they go to their Pluto line. Some of them, I just sort of read, I was quite surprised, like I didn't know this happened to Johnson, but there was just in Washington, there was a near fatal accident by chance. But some of them are difficult, like Carter. President Carter's had many attempts in his life, but they don't make it public. He's had so many. It's partly because he's been traveling and being in peace missions. But you know, there's, you know, George Bush to DC, he was on the stage and a live grenade fell to explode. Anyway, that's more evidence for astrocartography. Next slide, please. And this is something people often say, well, what happens if I've got a really difficult chart, I've got no good planets? Now this is one of the things that's important, is how do you judge the planets? Because that's, you know, I do it by using the aspects. I look for hard aspects, for difficult lines, and soft aspects, trines and sextiles, and that would suggest that the planet might be easy. But everybody has their own way of doing it, and you might do it by signs, or you might, but some way you'll be able to judge how the planets go. Now, sometimes there are people who have really difficult charts. And this is George Clooney, the actor, and he's got a T-square, and all those planets, I think Jupiter, Moon, Saturn, Mars, go through Los Angeles, cross with some other difficult planets. And he does not like getting that. That's where his work is in Hollywood, but he doesn't like getting that. He says he's worried about the earthquakes, but it might be that and probably more. And he actually ends up living in Italy where he has no lines. And this is the advice that I give to people. If the chart is difficult and you don't find lines, then it is better to be off lines than on a difficult line. And so, and what happens on off lines? If for instance, you've got a difficult chart, you find there's stress-free zones. You feel very relaxed, you feel very safe. But if you've got a chart that is an average chart with some nice planets and some difficult planets, you will actually get bored on offlines. You live off a line over time, one day rolls into the next, and you don't have any challenge. And so I generally would not recommend offlines except with people with very difficult charts. Next, please. On an ACG map, there's a point called the vortex where all the planets converge. Not all, but a number converge. And this is a phenomenon because due to the poles, where you can get points where the sun never rises, or the sun just goes around the horizon. And the same happens to the other planets. So you get these very odd results. And Jim actually went there. He went on a tour up to Norway with other astrologers. Okay, is that 5 minutes or what? That's it. Okay, I'll come to a close. Okay. And anyway, he just said basically anxiety producing, upsetting and difficult. And that's when you get just too many lines. Next. And we go on to the next. This is astrocartography, which is a technique of using transits and progressions in order to do, you actually move, you can do a forecast on an astrocartography map. And this is, I won't get into this at this point. This is something for another time. Do you want to go the other way? Go forward and you're going back. Keep going, that's it. Keep going, that's it. Basically that's, yeah, I mean, the thing is, what I want you to take away from this is always look at the natal chart and the map at the same time. And the other thing is, don't feel that, I know your clients might say, I want to know where I'm going to make money and I want to know where to avoid. But it isn't about avoiding places. It's about going to a place conscious of the energies that are in the location. And if you do that, you can get the most out of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robert Currey from the United Kingdom. बहुत अच्छी जानकारी दी उनके एस्ट्रो कार्टोग्राफी के ऊपर कि हम जो भी फोटोग्राफी करते हैं टाइमिंग के साथ उसके साथ ये कनेक्शन है। गुजारिश है आप लोगों से, हमारे विदेशी मेहमान अपने लाभ के लिए कुछ नॉलेज दे रहे हैं। हर उनका व्याख्यान खत्म होने के समय पे उनका स्वागत जरूर कीजिए ताकि के साथ उनका उत्साह बढ़ेगा यहाँ आने के लिए हमारे। अभी ये अनुवाद करेंगे जो उन्होंने लेक्चर दिया उनका हिंदी के अंदर।
नमस्ते। The मैं मिस्टर रॉबर्ट कुरी के एस्ट्रो कार्टो ग्राफी व्याख्यान का हिंदी में वर्णन करूंगी। एस्ट्रो कार्टो ग्राफी 1960s में जिम लुइस द्वारा स्थापित किया गया था। वो सैन फ्रांसिस्को में रहने वाले एक प्रतिभाशाली ज्योतिष थे। दुर्भाग्यजनक वे 53 साल की उम्र में 1995 में एक मस्तिष्क ट्यूमर से उनकी मौत हो गई। ये सब तब शुरू हुआ जब जिम बार बार यूएसए के रेगिस्तान से गुजरा करते थे, तो वे देखते थे कि उनकी गाड़ी का विभाजन हो जाया करता था सॉल्ट लेक सिटी के पास। एक चौकस और तेज नजर ज्योतिषी होने के नाते उन्होंने एक स्थानांतरित चार्ट बनाया जैसे कि वो उस शहर में पैदा हुए थे। उन्होंने देखा कि दो ग्रह बुध और मंगल ने एक पारण या पैरेंटेलोन का गठन किया हुआ है। एक पल जब दो ग्रह एक साथ एक ही कोण में होते हैं। किस तरह बुध तथा मंगल उनके झुलसाए वाहन के प्रतिबिंब प्रतीक हो गए, ये देखकर जिम लुइस चकित रह गए। निश्चित रूप से जिम ने सोचा कि वे इन पारण पॉइंट्स या बिंदुओं को पृथ्वी के मानचित्र में डाल सकते हैं। जिम अपने ग्राहकों के लिए प्रत्येक नक्शे को अपने हाथों से रेखांकन करते थे शुरुआत में, पर इसमें कई दिन लग जाते थे। अंततः इन नक्शों में बिंदुओं को बसाने का कार्यक्रम लिखने के लिए उन्होंने एक आकाशीय शिल्पकार को नियुक्त किया। उन्होंने इन नक्शों को एस्ट्रो कार्टो ग्राफी मैप्स या एसीजी मैप्स का नाम दिया। 1990 में मिस्टर रॉबर्ट कुरी ने जिम लुइस के तहत एसीजी मैप का अध्ययन किया। उन्होंने एसीजी मैप्स बनाने के लिए सॉफ्टवेयर लिखे। उनकी कंपनी इक्विनॉक्स अब इन नक्शों को दुनिया भर में बेचने के लाइसेंसधारी हैं और वो कुछ 30 साल के लिए एसीजी सलाहकारी भी रहे हैं। एसीजी नक्शा कैसे बनाया जाता है, इसे समझने के लिए एक आसान तरीका ये है कि हम पृथ्वी को आंशिक रूप से दिन के उजाले और अंधेरे में कल्पना करें। प्रकाश और अंधेरे के बीच की सीमा वृत्त के पश्चिम का सूर्योदय और पूर्व का सूर्यास्त है। गोलक को अगर हम चपटा करके लंबाई चौड़ाई यानी 2 डायमेंशनल की दिशा से देखें, इस सीमाओं को घुमावदार लाइनों के रूप में तैयार किया जा सकता है। इसके अलावा जो रेखाएं सूर्य के दोपहर और आधी रात के पर्दों को कवर करते हैं वो सीधे होते हैं और पोल्स के आर पार जाते हैं। एक ही 4 कोणीय लाइन हर ग्रह के लिए बनाया जा सकता है, लेकिन जब आप पैदा हुए थे तब आपके ग्रह किस कोण पर थे ये जानने की क्या उपयोगिता है। सबसे पहले ग्रहों के कोणों पर अधिक शक्तिशाली होते हैं। व्यक्ति जब चलता है तो उसके लोकल पावर लाइंस भी सक्रिय हो जाते हैं। यद्यपि लोग चरित्र में परिवर्तन नहीं करते, पर उनके स्वभाव का एक हिस्सा अधिक महत्वपूर्ण हो जाता है और इस विशेषता उस स्थान के अनुभवों, मुठभेड़ों और विचारों को नियंत्रित करता है। इसलिए ये स्वाभाविक है कि लोग मुश्किल स्थानों से दूर जाना चाहते हैं और उन जगहों पर जाना चाहते हैं जहां उन्हें सफल होने का मौका मिले। ये देखना भी लाभदायक है कि एस्ट्रो कार्टोग्राफी दुनिया के मंच पर कैसे काम करता है। सबसे अच्छा परीक्षण होगा अमेरिकी राष्ट्रपतियों की एस्ट्रो कार्टोग्राफी नक्शों को देखना। वे दुनिया में सबसे शक्तिशाली और प्रभावशाली लोगों में से हैं। उनका जन्म समय अक्सर सार्वजनिक अभिलेख में रहता है। विचार किया गया है कि 12 अमेरिकी राष्ट्रपतियों में से एक का भारत से संबंध हटके था। वे थे रिचर्ड निक्सन। इंदिरा गांधी के साथ उनका रिश्ता बहुत ही खराब था। दोनों एक दूसरे को अपमान किया करते थे। निक्सन इंदिरा गांधी को बहुत ही कठोर और अपमानजनक भाषा में वर्णित करते थे। ये तेज जबान इसलिए था क्योंकि निक्सन की कुंडली का बुध, मंगल और बृहस्पति के मिड हेवन लाइन्स या रेखाएं दिल्ली के ऊपर से जाता था। इसके अलावा प्लूटो आईसी पर विपरीत था, तो ये विन्यास कठोर अभद्र भाषा प्रयोग करने वाला व्यक्ति का प्रतीक है, जो खतरा और द्वेष को उस जगह पे देखता है जहां उसका अस्तित्व ही नहीं है। यही लक्षण के लिए निक्सन प्रसिद्ध थे। हालांकि उन्होंने चीन और पाकिस्तान के साथ बेहतर संबंध रखने में कामयाब रहे और दूसरी ओर इंदिरा गांधी भी अन्य अमेरिकी राष्ट्रपतियों के साथ अच्छे संबंध रखे। सभी राष्ट्रपति के वाशिंगटन के ऊपर से जाने वाले एस्ट्रो कार्टो ग्राफी रेखाएं उनके अध्यक्षता की प्रकृति का निर्धारण करता है। निक्सन के क्षेत्र में राजधानी के मिड हेवन में नेपच्यून था। यह ग्रह एक भ्रामक सार्वजनिक छवि के निर्माण और घोटाले की शंका के साथ जुड़ा हो सकता है। यह नकारात्मक रूप तब पूरी हुई जब वाटरगेट कांड के सिलसिले में 1974 में रिचर्ड निक्सन इस्तीफा देने पर मजबूर हो गए। हालांकि बैकहार्ड निक्सन ने अपनी मंगल रेखा पर भारत के साथ युद्ध करने के लिए नहीं गए। अगर निक्सन के मॉस्को पर बढ़ता हुआ मंगल ग्रह था, जिसके चलते वे रूस के राष्ट्रपति क्रुश्चेव को परमाणु युद्ध की धमकी भी दी थी। राष्ट्रपति फ्रैंकलिन रूजवेल्ट का मंगल का एलसी पर्ल हार्बर के ऊपर था, जो कि अमेरिका का द्वितीय विश्व युद्ध में प्रवेश करने का सबसे महत्वपूर्ण क्षण था। जिमी कार्टर के मंगल और बृहस्पति तेहरान को पार करता था, जहां वे एक धार्मिक युद्ध या जिहाद में शामिल हो गए। अमेरिकी बंधकों से जुड़े रिगन त्रिपोली पर बमबारी की। जॉर्ज एच बुश सीनियर खाड़ी युद्ध में इराक के खिलाफ एक गठबंधन का नेतृत्व किया। उनके बेटे जॉर्ज डब्ल्यू बुश ने अफगानिस्तान पर आक्रमण किया और अब बाराक ओबामा सीरिया और इराक में आईएसआईएस को उद्देश्य करके बमबारी अभियान में लगे हुए हैं और मॉस्को के राष्ट्रपति पुतिन के साथ भी उनका शत्रुतापूर्ण संबंध है। ये सभी राष्ट्रपतियों के एस्ट्रो कार्टो ग्राफी नक्शे पर मंगल ग्रह कर्ज पर हुई। सिर्फ बिल क्लिंटन इस अपवाद से बाहर है। वे किसी भी देश के साथ युद्ध पर नहीं गए या खुलेआम शत्रुतापूर्ण संबंध नहीं रखा। क्लिंटन के मंगल शुक्र और नेपच्यून से संयुक्त है, जो युद्धरत को शांतिवादी करने का प्रतीक है। बाल से ज्यादा एक कबूतर का प्रतीक। उनका मंगल का मिड हेवन रेखा ब्रिटेन और नॉर्थ आयरलैंड के माध्यम से जाता है। जब वे ऑक्सफोर्ड में छात्रवृत्ति पर थे, तब उन्होंने अपनी मंगल का इस्तेमाल लंदन में अमेरिकी दूतावास के बाहर वियतनाम युद्ध के खिलाफ विरोध प्रदर्शन करने के लिए किया था। बाद में राष्ट्रपति के रूप में वे नॉर्थ आयरलैंड में शांति लाने में मदद किए। तो जाहिर है मंगल ग्रह अनिवार्य रूप से हिंसक संघर्षों के लिए नेतृत्व नहीं करता। और क्या शुक्र यानी वेनस की रेखा हमेशा प्यार करने के लिए संचालित होते हैं? शुक्र का एक क्लासिक उदाहरण जॉन लेनन है। उनके शुक्र की रेखा, जो उनकी पत्नी योको ओनो के जन्म स्थान टोक्यो के माध्यम से जाता है। दूसरी तरफ योको ओनो का शुक्र रेखा लिवरपूल से जाता है, जो कि जॉन लेनन का जन्म स्थान है। आदर्श होगा अगर ज्योतिषी अपने ग्राहकों को प्यार की खोज पाने के लिए शुक्र की रेखा या सफलता पाने के लिए बृहस्पति की रेखा में खोज सकते हैं, पर ये उस तरह से नहीं होता। अब ये लुइस के लिए एक समस्या बन गया। 1980 के दशक तक वे कुछ लेख और एस्ट्रोकार्टोग्राफी के ऊपर पुस्तक भी प्रकाशित किया। उस किताब में अधिकांश सामग्री एक रसोई की किताब शैली जैसे था, काफी नकारात्मक। शनि के रेखाएं अकेलापन तथा गरीबी सहन करने के लिए मजबूर होंगे। नेपच्यून रेखा पर आपका अपराधियों से मेलजोल रहेगा और प्लूटो लाइन से आपको मौत का खतरा। कभी कभी हम सभी के अंदर अच्छाई और बुराई के बीच के एक आंतरिक युद्ध छिड़ता है, पर जिम उसके नतीजे से नाखुश थे। उसने एक क्राइसिस पॉइंट यानी संकट बिंदु पर पहुंचे और अनुसंधान में जुट गए कि क्या उनका ये तरीका काम नहीं कर रहा। उनका अनुसंधान उन्हें एक सरल परिणाम तक पहुंचाया। एस्ट्रोकार्टोग्राफी नक्शा एक व्यक्ति के जन्म के चार्ट या नक्शों से संयोजित होना चाहिए। एक एसीजी ग्रह की रेखा का प्रभाव जन्म के पहलुओं द्वारा मध्यस्थ की जानी चाहिए। जिम ने देखा कि कुछ ग्रहों को अन्य ग्रहों के साथ इतनी अनबन है कि वो ग्रह रिप्रेस हो जाते हैं, या कार्ल जंग की शब्दावली का प्रयोग करके हम कह सकते हैं वो छायादार या शैडो आर्चटाइप बन गए। इसलिए आदर्श स्थानों को खोजने के लिए सबसे आसान तरीका उन ग्रहों के खोज निकालना है जिनके पहलू सबसे आसान हो। इसका मतलब कोई व्यक्ति को उसकी ताकत के आधार से आचरण के लिए सक्षम किया जा सकता है, जो गुण और प्रतिभा व्यक्त करना सबसे आसान हो, उसे उसी स्थानों पर प्रयोग किया जा सकता है। यह एक फुटबॉल की क्षेत्र में बाएं पैर के फुटबॉल खिलाड़ी को लेफ्ट विंग में डालने जैसा होगा। लेफ्ट विंग पर वे फुटबॉलर आसानी से बॉल को गोल की ओर किक कर पाएगा। उनका परिवर्तन नहीं होगा, पर इस स्थान से वो ज्यादा सफल रहेंगे क्योंकि वह अपने शक्तिमान पैर का बेहतर उपयोग कर पाएंगे। जाहिर खान भी कुछ ऐसे ही उदाहरण के लिए उत्कृष्ट हैं। यहाँ मेरे अक्सर पूछे जाने सवालों का जवाब है। जहाँ रेखाएं नहीं होते हैं, उन स्थानों को क्या होता है? इन स्थानों को ऑफलाइंस कहते हैं और ये एक ऐसी सुरक्षित स्थान है जहाँ कोई विशेष कौशल या मुद्दों को प्रबल होने की आवश्यकता नहीं है। अगर कोई व्यक्ति के चार चौकोर और विरोधाभासी से भरा हुआ है और सिर्फ 2 या उससे भी कम ग्रह को जिसे चुनौती ना दिया गया हो, वे आदर्श होने के लिए इस स्थान में तनाव की कमी के कारण लाभवान होंगे। हालांकि कोई व्यक्ति जिसका एक आसान चार्ट हो और कुछ तेज पहलू हो और उसके साथ कम से कम 3 ग्रह चुनौतीपूर्ण पहलुओं से स्वतंत्र हो, ऐसे व्यक्ति का अनुभव बिल्कुल अलग होगा। शुरू में वो शांति का आनंद ले पाएंगे, लेकिन एक समय के बाद वे बेचैन हो जाएंगे और ऊब भी जाएंगे। उत्तेजना और चुनौती की कमी के कारण वे दूर विदेश यात्रा के लिए तरस जाएंगे। हर दिन एक जैसा होगा और जीवन में कोई बड़ी उपलब्धि नहीं होगी। क्या होगा अगर किसी ग्रह का कोई मुख्य या प्रमुख पहलू ना हो? लेखक ने पाया कि पहलूहीन ग्रह जोरदार प्रतिभा का इंगित या संकेत देता है। उदाहरण के लिए एक अनएक्सपेक्टेड या पहलूहीन बुध महान शिक्षक या लेखक का संकेत देता है। आमतौर पर हम 200 मील या 500 किलोमीटर की दूरी के बारे में सोचते हैं। हालांकि अन्य रेखाएं है या नहीं, इस पर यह बहुत ज्यादा निर्भर करता है। अगर कोई अन्य रेखा ना हो तो वृत्त की दूरी बढ़ जाती है। अगर ज्यादा रेखाएं हो और दोनों रेखाओं के ग्रह पहलू में हो तो ये प्रभाव का एक बड़ा क्षेत्र पैदा करता है। अगर ग्रह एक दूसरे के साथ पहलू में नहीं हो तो सबसे कड़ी ग्रह प्रबल होता है और वृत्त भी संकीर्ण होता है। जन्म का सही समय किस हद तक महत्वपूर्ण है? ये जानकारी महत्वपूर्ण है क्योंकि रेखाएं 750 मील प्रति घंटे की गति से 1200 किलोमीटर की दूरी पर कोलकाता के अक्षांश पश्चिम ओर आगे बढ़ रहे हैं। एस्ट्रो कार्टो ग्राफी एक बहुत ही बड़ा विषय है और मैंने यहाँ बहुत कुछ शामिल नहीं किया है। एक सप्ताह के पाठ्यक्रम 35 मिनट में समझाना बहुत ही मुश्किल काम है। एस्ट्रो कार्टो ग्राफी सिर्फ अच्छी जगह पे जाके बसना और कुछ स्थानों से बचने का पाठ नहीं है। ये उपयोगी हो सकता है, पर यह विकास और समझ बढ़ाने के लिए भी एक उपकरण है। सबसे मूल्यवान है कि आप इसे सटीक आय और सटीक यात्रा के लिए उपयोग कर सकते हैं। जहाँ पे आप स्थित हो उस जगह के सुविधाओं तथा खतरों के बारे में वाकिफ हो सकते हैं, ग्रहों की रेखाओं को ध्यान में रखकर और उसे समझकर। धन्यवाद।
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद अनुवाद के लिए। हमारे